My name is Jenna Ferris. I'm 34 and 2 months ago, my mother called me from the food court of Ridgeline Mall, her voice bright and unbothered, to tell me she'd misplaced my 3-year-old daughter for a little while. But not to worry, mall security had already found her sitting alone by the carousel, and everything was fine now. What she didn't tell me, what I only learned later from a timestamp on a security report, was that a little while meant 1 hour and 51 minutes, and that during almost every one of those minutes, my mother had been 3 stores away with my sister, buying back-to-school clothes for my sister's kids. I want to be honest about what that phone call did to me, because it wasn't the panic you'd expect. It was something colder and slower, a feeling like watching a wall you'd leaned your whole life against turn out to be painted cardboard. What I found underneath it over the following 10 weeks wasn't just carelessness. It was a pattern with paperwork behind it, and by the time I understood the full shape of it, my mother had already tried to use a piece of that paperwork to take something from me I never knew was at risk. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where quiet people finally stop absorbing what they were never supposed to carry alone. If you've ever had to fight to be believed about your own child, this one's for you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe, because this story does not end where you think it does. Let me take you back to the Tuesday it happened, and then further back than that, to the years that made it possible. I work as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, a job that trained me, without my realizing it at the time, to read documents the way most people read faces, for what's inconsistent, for what doesn't add up. That Tuesday I was in a coverage review meeting, when my phone lit up with my mother's number 3 times in a row. I stepped into the hallway to answer, already half braced for something, though not for one I got. "She's fine," my mother said before I'd even said hello, which is never a good way for anyone to start a sentence. Lily wandered off near the food court. Security found her by the carousel. "She's totally fine, Jenna. Don't make this a whole thing." I asked how long. My mother paused, and in that pause I heard her doing math she didn't want to do out loud. "Not that long," she said. "Under 2 hours, probably. Under 2 hours. My daughter is 3. I stood in that hallway outside a conference room with a stack of claims folders under my arm, and felt the floor tilt very slightly under me, the particular vertigo of hearing a sentence your brain refuses for a second to fully process. I need you to understand what my mother Sharon was to me before that day, because the version I believed in mattered enormously to how long I let this go unquestioned. Sharon raised my older sister Kayla and me largely alone after our father Walt died when I was 11. She worked 2 jobs for years. She showed up. Whatever else is true about her, I don't want to erase that she earned real trust, the kind you don't hand out for nothing. But trust like that has a blind spot built into it, and the blind spot was Kayla's 3 kids. Kayla had struggled financially for years, in and out of relationships that didn't help, and somewhere in the last decade my mother's love reorganized itself around rescuing Kayla's household the way she once rescued ours. My daughter Lily, born 4 years ago, to a stable marriage and a mother with a steady paycheck, simply never triggered that same instinct in Sharon. I'd noticed the difference in small ways for years. Kayla's kids got the bigger birthday gifts, the longer visits, the photos posted first. I'd told myself the way you tell yourself things that let you keep showing up, that it didn't matter, that love isn't a pie, that I had enough. I believed that story right up until I found out my mother had left my 3-year-old alone in a mall to go finish someone else's shopping list. I drove to the mall instead of home because I needed to see the actual place before I could believe the actual thing. My husband Marcus met me there, already holding Lily, who was subdued in the particular quiet way toddlers get after something scared them that they don't have words for yet. She had a churro in one hand that a security guard had bought her, and a sticker on her shirt that said Ridgeline Mall Safe Kids, and she looked up at me and said, "Grandma went shopping," in a flat, small voice that told me she'd already understood, at 3, that this required an explanation she didn't have. Minimized. A guard on the food court beat had noticed Lily alone at a table for roughly 20 minutes before approaching her, at which point she couldn't say where her grandmother was, only that Grandma said stay. Security paged the mall directory, checked cameras, and located Sharon and Kayla in a children's clothing store 4 doors down, where they'd apparently been for over an hour. The full window, door camera to door camera, was 1 hour and 51 minutes. I asked the security supervisor, mostly out of the same instinct that made me good at my job, whether incident reports like this were kept on file. She said yes, routinely, for liability reasons, and that I was entitled to request a copy, as the parent involved. I said I'd like one. I didn't know yet why I needed it. I just knew, standing in that beige little office with my daughter's arms wrapped around my neck, that I wanted a version of this day that existed outside my mother's lab. Voice. Sharon's story shifted twice in the first week, in the way stories shift when someone is building toward a version they can live with, rather than reporting what happened. First it was, she wandered off, kids do that. Then, when I mentioned the door camera timestamp, it became, I checked on her, I just went back to shopping in between, a claim the footage directly contradicted. There was no in-between. Then, when I stopped accepting either version, it became about me. You're twisting this into something it wasn't. I raised 2 kids alone. I know what I'm doing. What unsettled me more than the incident itself was a comment my Aunt Diane made at a family barbecue 2 weeks later, the kind of comment people make when they assume you already know something. Well, you know how your mom gets when she's with Kayla's kids, Diane said, not unkindly, refilling her lemonade. She's done that before. Lost track of Lily at your cousin's graduation party, remember? I figured somebody told you. Nobody had told me. That was the moment the mall stopped being an isolated bad afternoon and started being one data point in a pattern I hadn't been shown the rest of. I started asking, quietly, the way you ask questions when you're not yet sure you want the answers. I called my cousin, who confirmed the graduation party story with more detail than I wanted. 45 minutes, a different mall, my mother distracted helping Kayla's oldest with a video game console purchase, while Lily sat with strangers near a pretzel stand. I called Marcus's mother, who babysits sometimes too, and asked if she'd ever noticed anything. She hadn't, but she said something that stuck with me. I've noticed your mom talks about Kayla's kids' futures a lot. College funds, savings bonds. She's never once mentioned anything like that for Lily. I hadn't thought about money yet. I was still thinking about safety. But that sentence planted something I couldn't unplant, and 3 days later, going through a box of my late father's paperwork that I'd inherited and never fully sorted, I found the document that turned this from a parenting disagreement into something with real legal weight. My father, Walt, had set up a small trust before he died, funded modestly with his life insurance payout, explicitly for the education of my grandchildren, in equal shares, current and future. I remembered this vaguely from childhood, the way you remember adult conversations you weren't meant to fully understand. The trust had named my mother as trustee, responsible for managing and eventually distributing it, since Kayla and I were both still teenagers when he died, and he hadn't trusted either of us yet to manage it directly. I hadn't thought about that trust in 15 years. I assumed, the way you assume things you've never had reason to check, that it existed, somewhere quietly doing what it was meant to do. What I found in that box was an old annual trustee statement from 8 years ago, the last one my mother had apparently ever bothered to send any of us, showing the account at just under $40,000. I called the bank listed on the statement, using my legal standing as a named beneficiary's parent, and after some transferring and paperwork got a current balance. The account held $612. I sat with that number for 2 days before I said anything to anyone, because I needed to understand it before I could accuse anyone of anything. I requested the full transaction history, which the bank was legally required to provide to a beneficiary's guardian on request, and it took another 11 days to arrive. When it did, the pattern in the withdrawals wasn't hidden or coded, it was just repeated over and over, plainly labeled in a way that told me my mother once imagined anyone would look. Tuition payments to Kayla's oldest child's private middle school. A down payment transferred to Kayla for a used minivan, memo line family transport. Summer camp fees, 3 separate years, for 2 of Kayla's kids. Not one withdrawal, in 8 years, had gone toward anything with Lily's name on it because Lily hadn't been born yet for most of that span. But the trust document said current and future grandchildren, and Lily's birth 4 years ago should have entitled her to an equal claim on whatever remained. There was nothing left to claim. My mother had spent my father's trust, meant for both her daughter's children equally, entirely on one household, over the better part of a decade, and had stopped sending statements the exact year the spending accelerated. I confronted her on the phone first, not in person, because I didn't trust my own face yet to stay calm, and I needed calm for this conversation more than I'd ever needed it for anything. I asked her directly why the trust for all grandchildren had a zero balance for the only grandchild who hadn't caused it to be spent. She didn't deny the withdrawals. She said Kayla needed the help more, that Walt would have understood, that I was well off, and didn't need it the way Kayla's family did, that treating it as theft was cruel to a grandmother who had sacrificed everything for this family. I told her that wasn't her decision to make alone, that Dad had named her trustee, not owner, and that a trustee who spends trust assets outside the terms of the trust has a legal name for what she's done, whether or not she meant harm by it. She hung up on me. It was the first time in my life my mother had ever hung up on me, rather than the other way around, and something about that felt like its own kind of confession. 2 weeks after that call, I got a strange voicemail from a clerk at the county family court, asking me to call back regarding a pending filing related to my daughter, Lily Ferris. I hadn't filed anything with family court in my life. I called back the next morning, hands not quite steady on the phone, and learned that my mother had submitted paperwork to activate a standby guardian designation for Lily. A form I slowly remembered as the clerk described it that I had signed nearly 3 years earlier, during the worst week of my life, when I was hospitalized for 10 days with a postpartum complication, and Marcus was overseas for a work deployment he couldn't get out of. Sharon had stepped in that week. I'd signed a temporary standby guardian form at the hospital's suggestion, a routine safety net in case both parents became simultaneously unavailable, and I had never revoked it because I had never needed to think about it again. Until now, my mother, 3 years later, with no medical emergency and both of Lily's parents, perfectly healthy and present, had filed a request asking the court to review and formalize that standby designation into something closer to permanent, citing in her own handwriting on the petition ongoing concerns about the child's home stability. I read that phrase 4 times before it made sense to me as an actual sentence someone had written about my home. Concerns about stability. My mother, who had left my daughter alone in a mall for nearly 2 hours and spent her college trust fund on someone else's children, had gone to family court to suggest that my home, Marcus's and mine, with 2 working parents, a functioning marriage, and a pediatrician who'd never flagged a single concern in Lily's 4 years of life, was the thing that needed watching. I understood, reading it, that the mall incident and the trust and this filing weren't 3 separate problems anymore. They were one long story about who my mother believed deserved protecting and who she believed could simply be managed. I had spent 34 years assuming I was in the first category. I wasn't. I had just never been declared unstable loudly enough. Until now, when declaring it served a purpose. I hired a family law attorney the same week, a woman named Priya Nair, who specialized in guardianship disputes, and the first thing she told me was the thing that finally let me breathe. An old standby designation from a hospital emergency doesn't override 2 present competent parents. She said, "This filing isn't strong, but it's not nothing either, because now there's a document with your signature on it sitting in a court file, and until we formally revoke it and respond to her petition, a judge could technically schedule a hearing on it, which means you have to treat it seriously, even though it shouldn't go anywhere." We filed a formal revocation of the standby designation and a response to my mother's petition within the week, along with, on Priya's advice, a request that the court note the mall security incident report and the trust account discrepancy as context, not to punish my mother criminally, but to establish clearly, on the record, why her petition lacked the good faith basis it claimed. Kayla called me the night after we filed, and that conversation told me something I hadn't fully let myself consider yet. That my sister might not have been only a bystander in any of this. She was crying, asking me to drop it, saying Mom was just trying to help, and that I was destroying the family over money. I asked her, directly, whether she'd known about the trust withdrawals. There was a long silence before she said quietly that she'd known some of it, that Sharon had told her years ago it was Dad's way of taking care of the kids who needed it, and that she hadn't asked more because she needed the help too badly to ask hard questions about where it was coming from. I didn't yell at her. I understood, in a strange way, exactly the position she'd been in, the same position I'd been in for years, just on the other side of it, accepting a story because the alternative was harder. But I told her that needing help didn't make it hers to take from a trust that had my daughter's name on it too, and that I needed her to decide soon whether she was going to keep pretending she hadn't known, in front of a judge, if it came to that. The hearing, when it finally came 6 weeks later, was smaller and quieter than the version I'd built up in my head. There was no dramatic courtroom confrontation. A family court commissioner reviewed the filings in a conference room, not a courtroom, with Priya presenting the timeline calmly. The mall incident report, the graduation party account for my cousin submitted as a signed statement, the trust transaction history, and the original hospital emergency context for the standby form. My mother's attorney, a man she'd apparently hired only 4 days earlier, argued that the petition had been a grandmother's overzealous concern, not bad faith. The commissioner didn't rule on the trust misuse at all. That wasn't in her jurisdiction. Priya had told me it likely wouldn't be, that she formally voided the standby designation, noted in the record that no current evidence supported any concern about Lily's home stability, and recommended, pointedly, that any future guardianship petition regarding Lily be supported by current, documented cause. Language Priya told me afterward was as close to a warning as a commissioner typically puts on paper. My mother did not look at me once during the 20 minutes it took. The trust itself became a separate, quieter matter. Priya connected me with a probate attorney, since trustee misconduct falls under different rules than guardianship, and rather than pursue anything that would have dragged my mother through a public accounting fight, I chose, deliberately, the way I'd learned to choose things by then, the option that got Lily something rather than the option that got my mother punished. We sent a formal demand letter requiring Sharon to either restore a proportional share to a new account for Lily or step down as trustee in favor of a neutral one. She chose, after 2 more weeks of arguing through lawyers, to step down. A modest amount, nowhere close to what had been spent on Kayla's children over the years, because there was genuinely nothing left to draw from, was set aside instead directly by Marcus and me in Lily's name, administered by a bank trust officer with no family connection to any of us at all. I want to tell you the family gathering where everything finally came out into the open happened dramatically, the way these things sometimes do, but it didn't. Happened at a small birthday dinner for my cousin's daughter, ordinary and low-key, where my mother showed up expecting, I think, that enough time had passed for things to quietly reset the way they always had before. Aunt Diane, who'd let the graduation party detail slip months earlier without meaning to start any of this, asked me gently, in front of 6 or 7 relatives, how the whole court thing had turned out. I told the truth, briefly and without heat. The standby designation was voided, the trust had been reassigned to a neutral trustee, and Lily was safe and cared for. That was all I said. I didn't need to say more, because for the first time, nobody in that room needed me to convince them of anything. The mall incident report had apparently made its way around the family already, the way things do, and the silence that followed wasn't shock. It was recognition. My mother spoke only once, near the end of the night, catching me alone by the drinks table while Marcus took Lily to see the birthday cake. "I never meant to hurt her," she said, meaning Lily, and I believe that part was true. I just always felt like Kayla's kids needed me more. I told her I understood that feeling was real to her. I also told her that a 3-year-old sitting alone at a food court table for almost 2 hours doesn't experience the difference between being forgotten out of malice and being forgotten out of favoritism. It just experiences being forgotten, and that distinction, the one my mother clearly still needed me to honor, mattered enormously to her and not at all to Lily. She didn't have a response to that. For the first time in my life, my mother stood in front of me with nothing prepared to say. Kayla and I are rebuilding something slowly in the specific careful way you rebuild a relationship with someone who benefited, even passively, from something that hurt you. She apologized without qualifiers eventually, once she'd had time away from Sharon's version of events to sit with her own. Her kids still see Lily at holidays. I've made peace with the fact that some of what was spent on them can't be undone and shouldn't need to be, because they're children too, and none of this was their doing. My relationship with my mother is smaller now than it used to be, by my choice, not out of punishment, but out of something closer to accuracy. She sees Lily twice a month, always with Marcus or me present, an arrangement I proposed and she accepted without argument, which told me more than any apology could have. 6 months after the mall, I took Lily back there, on purpose, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon with no shopping list and nowhere else to be. We got churros at the same stand and rode the carousel 3 times, and I sat on the bench near the food court where a security guard once found my daughter alone and let herself wonder where her grandmother had gone. Lily doesn't remember most of it now, the way 3-year-olds mercifully don't hold on to things the way adults do. I remember all of it. I think I'm supposed to. I don't know if my mother has fully understood, even now, that the mall was never really the beginning of this story. It was just the first thing loud enough that I couldn't talk myself past it. Everything underneath it. The trust, the favoritism, the standby form she tried to weaponize, had been sitting there for years, quiet and load-bearing, the way most family patterns are, until one ordinary Tuesday made it impossible to keep pretending the pattern wasn't real. I used to think loving my mother meant giving her the benefit of every doubt, indefinitely, no matter what the evidence in front of me said. I don't think that anymore. I think loving someone, even someone who raised you, has to leave room for the possibility that they got something badly wrong, and that noticing it isn't betrayal. It's just finally telling the truth about what you saw. My daughter is safe. Her trust has her name on it now, permanently, held by someone with no favorites. And I've learned that the quietest kind of justice isn't the kind that humiliates anyone in a crowded room. It's the kind that simply makes sure it can never happen again. That's my story. One phone call from a food court, one old form nobody thought to revoke, and a trust with a balance that told the truth before anyone else would. If this reminded you that protecting your child sometimes means questioning the people who are supposed to help you protect them, take that as your sign. Check the paperwork. Trust the numbers over the version you're told. Thank you for watching Sweet Payback Stories. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.